Tonight on Ukraine Today, explosions inside Russia, from a drone attack on the Empils plant in Rostov-on-Don to a very loud night in temporarily occupied Donetsk and Makiivka. Occupier losses. Why more than 1,200,000 killed and wounded invaders still do not stop the Kremlin. New threats from old rulers. How likely is it that Russia could start a war against Armenia? Kyiv and Chișinău strike back. What is really happening to Russian occupiers in the so-called Transnistria? All this and more, right now. Hello, I'm Volodymyr Robchun and this is Ukraine Today. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a like and let's move on to the news. We begin with explosions inside Russia. Reports are coming in about a drone attack on the Empils plant in Rostov-on-Don. Preliminary information suggests that fuel storage tanks are on fire. It was also quite interesting to watch the work of Russian air defense. In these images, you can see a missile rising into the air, then suddenly changing its trajectory, falling into a residential area and exploding. It was also loud in temporarily occupied Donetsk and Makiivka. Information about the consequences of the attack is still being clarified. Russian occupiers failed to establish a bridgehead in the Sumy region. Well, to be precise, the defense forces of Ukraine prevented Russian troops from forming a bridgehead in the Sumy region. More details on the battlefield situation next.
Drones from Ukrainian unmanned systems forces caused a blackout in Mariupol. Telegram channels are flooded with videos from the city temporarily occupied by the Russians. Also, during the night of January 12th to 13th, strikes were carried out in temporarily occupied Makiivka and Stary Krim. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirms attacks on ammunition depots, concentrations of personnel, and a Tor air defense missile system in Donetsk region. Another Tor air defense system, a radar station, as well as enemy personnel were eliminated in the Zaporizhzhia direction.
So essentially, this is Ukraine's approach. Russia attacks us, but we strike back in response. Accordingly, when blackouts are created for us in Ukraine, we create them not only in territories not controlled by Ukraine, but also on Russian territory, such as Belgorod and its strongholds. So now Ukraine, having sufficient capabilities, allows itself to attack energy-generating facilities, both on its own territory that has been occupied by Russia and on Russian territory.
A fireworks display was observed in Yelets-Lipetsk region. Unknown drones attacked Taganrog. The Atlant Aero enterprise, which, among other things, produces components for combat drones, came under attack. Control systems as well as electronic warfare complexes.
First and foremost, and most importantly, of course, these are missiles. However, there are significantly fewer missiles available than there are drones. Accordingly, seeing the devastating damage that Russian drones inflict on a daily basis, and especially during the nightly attacks in Ukraine, Ukrainian intelligence services primarily identify certain specific facilities within Russia that enable them to produce these drones. And accordingly, when we set the priorities for our attacks, the top priority is whatever enables Russia to manufacture drones. The strike on Taganrog is a strike including against Russia's ability to carry out nightly drone attacks on Ukraine, where production facilities have been established using technology borrowed from Iran.
In these shots, you see the 108th Separate Territorial Defense Brigade, the detonation of an enemy ground drone loaded with anti-tank mines. And these are the fighters of the 2nd Corps of the National Guard of Ukraine. Khartia has established control over the building of the Kupiansk City Council in Kharkiv region and is completing the clearing of the city.
Stories like these, in addition to being real military successes, are also image victories. These are talking points that resonate on the international stage. While Russia claims that everything is going great for them, you can see for yourself that it's not the case, that their successes aren't as significant as they say. And this makes our partners think, okay, if Ukraine is still fighting after 4 years of full-scale war, then it means they can keep supporting it. It's not a waste of resources for nothing.
Iran has sold Russia nearly $3 billion worth of missiles. This was reported by Bloomberg. According to expert estimates, in total, Russians have spent over $4 billion on Iranian military equipment, including spare parts. At this point, it is known that the occupiers are using both Iranian-developed technologies directly and imitations of those technologies.
Over the past 24 hours, Russia has lost at least 990 occupiers, killed and wounded. That brings the total since the start of the full-scale invasion to 1,221,940 invaders. In addition, over the last day, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 6 Russian tanks, 3 armored combat vehicles, 74 artillery systems, and dozens of other pieces of enemy military equipment. Let me repeat this again, just to understand the scale of Russian losses. 1,221,940 killed and wounded occupiers. Is that a lot or not? Common sense says these numbers are enormous, yet Russia stubbornly continues its war. Why? The answer in the report.
Record after record, Russian losses in the war with Ukraine have exceeded 1,200,000 killed and wounded.
And if you take into account that there are also losses we know exist but simply cannot count, they're somewhere deep in the rear, then in reality the number is even higher.
Literally every day, Ukraine's defense forces eliminate more than 1,000 Russians.
What are you doing in Ukraine? In the Kharkovsk region?
Terrible, terrible.
Well, terrible.
But not terrible, terrible, terrible.
So we're talking about losses of up to 33,000 per month, killed, wounded, and captured. And we know that now, when most of the losses are from precision drone strikes and evacuation is extremely difficult, the number of those killed is high. It turns out there are more killed than wounded.
At the same time, Putin claims that the losses of the Russian army are minimal.
Well, I can tell you with absolute confidence that our losses, especially when it comes to unfortunately irreparable losses, are of course several times less than those on the Ukrainian side.
We have drone footage confirming these deaths. Russian attacks are always incredibly bloody, but Putin doesn't care about that. Russians don't count their dead, but they count every dollar and euro they lose. And
according to the Russian dictator, Ukrainian soldiers have almost run out. And never mind that this almost has been going on for nearly 4 years. According
to our calculations, the Ukrainian army loses about 50,000 people per month. But these are both sanitary and irrecoverable losses. And the current measures, this total mobilization, do not solve the problems. Because according to our data, which we receive from various sources, they are recruiting about 30,000 people per month. That's how many they are able to enlist.
Meanwhile, why is Russian mobilization so rapid? And where do the hundreds of thousands of conscripts go? Propaganda stays silent.
The special military operations are proceeding strictly according to schedule, as planned. All assigned tasks are being successfully accomplished.
It turns out that every month, Russia loses more people killed than the USSR did during the entire Afghan war. In just 1 month, or nearly 700 people for every square kilometer. And accordingly, now not only analysts but also NATO representatives are saying that the losses are already approaching the rate at which new contract soldiers are being recruited.
But even if we take only the most official figures from open Russian sources, the number of those killed exceeds Russian losses in all wars since World War II combined.
In this sense, we have not suffered a single loss. In vain.
This is the minimum figure of Russian army losses in this war. Because this number, 153,000 people, has a last name, first name, patronymic, date of birth, date of death, place of death, a link to the obituary, a link to the hero's desk in the region, a link to some memorial service. That is, all these 153,000 people are accounted for. This is not an inflated number.
Analysts claim that with this number of local assaults, falling oil and gas revenues, and declining recruitment rates, the Russian army will soon experience what is called negative growth.
Is it possible to speed up the resolution of the tasks before us? It is possible, but it is directly proportional to the losses. Speed is important, but even more important is caring for the lives and health of our guys who are fighting on the front lines.
Because as soon as irrecoverable losses exceed the rate of recruitment, the Russian army, and therefore its offensive potential, will begin to shrink. It turns out that in the coming months we can expect an even greater increase in Russian losses. Apparently, even Putin understands this. That's why, on his orders, commanders have been sending soldiers into as many suicidal attacks as there have been all year.
We're feeling incredibly bored. It's stagnant and dull, and we are wanting some real action.
But it's interesting, just what number on the loss counter will it take? The bloodthirsty Russian dictator is ready to keep up his fun.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. Now's the time to subscribe, like this video and share it, so more people can see it. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. Now imagine this. The Kremlin is planning to start another war, not only against NATO countries. Can you imagine that? Because it might be real. Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovyov has started talking about a possible so-called special military operation, a war against Armenia.
The Russian ambassador to Yerevan, Sergei Kopyrkin, was summoned to the Armenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This was in response to a statement made by Russia's chief propagandist Vladimir Solovyov on his propaganda show.
What is happening in Armenia is much more painful for us than what is happening in Venezuela. The loss of Armenia, that is a gigantic problem. To hell with international law, with the international order. Is there anything for our national security? Was it necessary to start the special military operation on the territory of Ukraine? Why, based on the very same considerations, can't we start a special military operation in other areas within our sphere of influence?
The Kremlin's mouthpiece suggested launching another special military operation in Armenia. Supposedly, the loss of this country is not in the Kremlin's interests, and in this case, a special military operation would be just the thing, and we can simply disregard international law. In the Armenian media, Ambassador Kopyrkin was handed a note of protest.
He was presented with a note of protest expressing deep outrage at the statements made on the state television channel's broadcast. It was emphasized that these statements are an unacceptable encroachment on the sovereignty of the Republic of Armenia, a hostile act, and a gross violation of the fundamental principles of friendly relations between Armenia and Russia.
This is not the first time Solovyov has issued threats against Russia's neighboring countries, including Armenia. In March 2024, the country blocked the broadcast of his original programs due to repeated violations. But such statements by the propagandist are not made without reason.
Solovyov's talking points are not made up out of thin air. Russia's chief propagandist expresses a version that is coordinated with the Kremlin's position. Always, in fact. Especially on topics like these. I've said more than once that after the shameful war in Ukraine, Putin will need a small victorious war. 100% just to somehow cover up the disgrace of defeat in Ukraine. That's why Solovyov is voicing possible directions.
Back last summer, the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine stated that the Russian Federation was increasing its military presence in Armenia.
The main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine publishes a telegram from the acting chief of staff of the Southern Military District. From Russia, Major General Zemsky. The document contains an order from the commander of the troops of the Southern Military District of the Russian Federation to increase the grouping of Russian forces by so-called additional staffing of the Russian military base in the city of Gyumri, Armenia.
Gyumri is home to Russia's 102nd military base, the largest military facility of the occupiers in the South Caucasus. The personnel numbers about 5,000 people, 2,500 Russians and 2,000 Armenians. The base is equipped with S-300 surface-to-air missile systems and 18 MiG-29 fighter jets. So this is quite a formidable strike force, which could, for example, seize the airport in Yerevan and secure the landing of Russia's main forces. The Russian army attempted a similar seizure at the Hostomel airfield near Kyiv in February 2022.
In Armenia, there's no need to seize anything. There is already an air base and an airfield there. Erebuni is under Russian control. Right in Yerevan, which is controlled by Russian military forces. Military planes landed there, and that's it. The agreement between Armenia and Russia allows Russia to operate military facilities, including this airbase, Erebuni, until 2044.
The war in Ukraine has changed the attitude of CIS countries and other neighbors toward Russia. Since 2022, propagandists and top Kremlin officials have repeatedly threatened their neighbors. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are mining bridges and building fences on the border. Since the beginning of this year, Finland has ceased to be a participant in the anti-personnel mine ban treaty. Azerbaijan is already openly supporting Ukraine in practice. And Baku has a strong ally, Turkey. Armenia appears to be the most vulnerable and easiest option for the Kremlin, especially since the military base in Gyumri is almost the only lever of military political pressure on the countries of the South Caucasus. But this is a protest. The Armenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. After Solovyov's statement, this is good, but Yerevan needs to take more decisive steps to prevent another special military operation from starting on their territory.
And finally, the security situation in Moldova, which directly affects Ukraine. Let me start from a bit further away. Romania is ready to seriously discuss the possibility of unification with Moldova. This was stated by presidential advisor Eugen Tomac. Earlier, Moldovan President Maia Sandu said she would support this idea if it received approval in a nationwide referendum. Such a step, in my view, would definitely help resolve the issue of Russian occupiers in the so-called Transnistria. But that is for the future. Right now, Kyiv and Chișinău have gone on the offensive against Kremlin occupiers and have cut them off from supplies from Russia. All the details next.
From a strategic foothold to an anchor that drags you even further down, Transnistria has found itself blockaded thanks to the coordinated actions of Ukraine and Moldova. The 1,500-strong Russian contingent is not surrounded militarily, but it is encircled nonetheless.
In fact, thanks to the control of pro-European forces in Moldova, the security services and law enforcement agencies have essentially been driven out. The border guards are now under the authority of Moldova's Minister of Internal Affairs. All of this prevents the Kremlin from carrying out its intentions.
The point is that Kyiv and Chișinău simultaneously introduced enhanced border control measures. As a result, the Kremlin instantly lost its usual channels of influence and logistics in the region. Reportedly, all corridors through which weapons had been brought into Transnistria for decades, as well as routes for military rotation, equipment, and fuel supply, were simultaneously closed. As a result, the entire Russian group was effectively...
The subject has been completely and effectively immobilized for the duration. It's more of a risk factor than an actual resource. The most vulnerable point is the fuel from their own refineries. There are no imports, they depended on external routes, and under isolation the equipment loses its mobility. The conclusion is simple. In 2026, Transnistria is a strategic dead end for Russia.
It is known that at the moment, Ukraine is thoroughly inspecting all flows of people and cargo entering Transnistria. The Moldovans have also reinforced their checkpoints and deployed mobile units for total control over movements. At the same time, Moldova controls the airspace, ruling out any air deliveries, and rail and road transport is only allowed under strict customs clearance. Also, since the beginning of the year, Kyiv and Chișinău have linked their border control systems, so that cargo or people can only pass with the approval of both sides. Another significant factor was intelligence data indicating that the Russian Federation planned to increase its contingent in 2026. In Transnistria,
it is obvious that the Russian Federation was planning to use it essentially as a kind of land-based aircraft carrier in order to launch attacks with divisional groups against Belarus and against southern Ukraine, the Odessa and Vinnytsia regions.
Experts say that such measures could soon have an impact hundreds of kilometers away from the Moldovan-Ukrainian border, directly on the front lines.
In addition to the fighting on the front lines, we are constantly forced to keep reserves and stay on edge from two directions. Belarus, where there is a certain Russian contingent, and we expect that something could come from there at any moment, even if it's something small. And Transnistria, near Odessa and near the Mykolaiv region, where there are also 1,500 Russian soldiers. Warehouses, all those things. This also forces us to constantly keep certain forces there. Not random or weak ones, but quite capable forces, so that we can repel an attack if necessary.
For the Kremlin, analysts explain the situation looks like a dead end. The region has no access to the sea and no functioning air routes. This means that troop rotation and regular supplies are virtually impossible without the consent of Chișinău and Kyiv. It is not possible to resolve this issue by military means. The existing Russian group is insufficient and any landing operation is doomed to fail. The only correct solution in this situation can be the withdrawal of Russian troops from the region, which is the ultimate goal for both Moldova and Ukraine.
It is necessary to thoroughly examine what the Russian operational group of troops actually is and to propose appropriate solutions for dismantling this structure. But at the same time, on the left bank, there is also the so-called Transnistrian army. On 12 Manoilova Street in Tiraspol, there is the so-called Ministry of State Security, which is something like the MGB or NKVD keeps the residents of the left bank in fear. There are various kinds of special battalions, so the unification of the country involves, in my opinion, a technically feasible, the complete demilitarization of this region.
At the same time, Moldova has gone even further. In a recent interview, the country's president, Maia Sandu, stated that she supports the idea of uniting Moldova and Romania. If such a unification takes place, Chișinău will automatically find itself both in the EU and in NATO. And consequently, it will be forever out of reach for Russia.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share. See you next time.